Hello, and welcome back to the 14th instalment of my failed franchises series. In this series, I look at whether defunct rail franchises should be deemed as failed, whether this be their contract being stripped from them or their franchise simply being deemed poor by the public and industry. In today's video, I'll be looking at the second privatised East Coast Mainline operator, National Express East Coast, and how they became one of Britain's shortest-lived franchises. But can they truly be classed as a failed franchise? That's what I'll discuss in today's video. Do ensure you subscribe so you don't miss the other episodes of this East Coast Mainline Operators mini-series, and check out the rest of my failed franchises videos if you enjoy this one. Thank you. Firstly, let's look at how National Express East Coast, NXEC, became an operator. Well, to fully understand the situation, you must watch my video on the previous operator, GNER, who lost their contract in December 2006 due to high costs required to be paid back from GNER to the Department for Transport, 1.3 billion to be precise. This was just not feasible for GNER to pay back in their franchise agreements, and, after the collapse of their parent company, they lost their contract. So, the search was on for a new operator. Many were calling for the renationalisation of the Intercity East Coast franchise. However, the Department for Transport and the Strategic Rail Authority did not see that as a practical solution, and believed that privatisation was the way forward, despite themselves being a Labour government. Instead, they called for 4 companies to come forward and lodge bids for the next Intercity East Coast franchise. These were Arriva, First, National Express and Virgin. Eventually, National Express was awarded the franchise in August 2007, branding themselves as National Express East Coast. Starting in December 2007, NXEC operated a broad network across England and Scotland. They operated regular services from London King's Cross towards Leeds, York, Newcastle, Edinburgh and Glasgow, via stations such as Peterborough and Doncaster. NXEC also ran less frequent minor routes from London to Hull, Bradford, Lincoln, Skipton, Harrogate, Aberdeen and Inverness, with these routes usually being operated just once or twice a day. As for rolling stock, NXEC would inherit all of the Intercity 225 sets, as well as 14 Class 43s, along with 56 Mark III carriages for the non-electrified services. As part of the franchise, National Express East Coast promised capacity increases, with an extra 25 services each weekday out of London, and a new London to Lincoln service running once every 2 hours, although this was eventually reduced to 1 train per day. As for rolling stock, as aforementioned, there would be no new fleet for National Express East Coast, despite many calling for the replacement of the Intercity 225 sets. But they would gain more HST sets from redundant former Virgin West Coast HSTs. However, the Strategic Rail Authority did not learn from their mistakes with GNER. As part of the franchise agreements, NXEC would have to pay the DfT £1.4 billion over the course of the 7.5-year deal, something that was actually deemed to be medium risk by the Department for Transport, even more riskier given that this figure was more than GNER were expected to repay prior. Transport Minister Tom Harris said the new operator would be good news for passengers and the taxpayer. Despite the concerns, National Express East Coast commenced operations on the 9th of December 2007 under a new branding. National Express would incorporate a new grey and white modern livery rolled out across a 2-year period. However, only the HSTs would ever receive this new livery. Operations-wise, there's not a huge lot to even say about National Express East Coast, given the length of the time that they operated for, or lack of. However, there are a few talking points. Firstly, they were much worse than GNER. Whereas GNER prided itself for its splendid service and great catering, National Express East Coast didn't. By the first year of their operations, they withdrew many of their restaurant cars, with just 15 services remaining with restaurant cars by 2009, down from 51 prior to the cutbacks. By their first anniversary in 2008, ticket prices had risen 7.4%, but passengers had risen by 1 million, with Deputy Managing Director Susan Goldsmith saying the company was improving, despite the economic downturn of 2008. In 2009, however, financial pressures grew on National Express East Coast. However, they did open up a new lounge at London King's Cross, although this wasn't enough to woo over customers, who still believed the service was a huge downgrade when put against the previous GNER operations. By the end of 2009, the second year of operations, National Express East Coast were in dire straits. The global financial crisis had scuppered the company's chances at profitability, and they were not looking likely to be able to repay the £1.4 billion they owed to the Department for Transport. The increase in fuel and electricity prices hadn't helped the company, and they were forced to raise ticket prices and include a £2.50 reservation charge per journey, angering passengers. Ticket sales also fell 1% in the first few months of 2009, with calls from trade unions to renationalise the operator, worried about threats from National Express of staff cuts and potentially leading to mass union walkouts. National Express East Coast also weren't able to deliver the timetable upgrades they promised, including the one train per 2 hours service to Lincoln, despite paying for 5 Class 180s for the service. Although they did refit the Class 43 HST locomotives to ensure reliability was as high as possible. And indeed, National Express East Coast did have impressive punctuality, consistently averaging around 90% of their services being on time. Despite this, NXEC were in serious trouble, and they confirmed in April 2009 that they were pursuing financial support or other assistance from the Department for Transport to ensure that they didn't collapse. To make matters worse, National Express relied on the fact that Network Rail would pay them reimbursements for their poor infrastructure problems. They assumed that Network Rail would not be up to scratch and would thus pay them a lot of money during their contract, helping them to pay back the £1.4 billion. They were thus shocked when Network Rail's performance improved significantly compared to Railtrack previously, and repayments gradually dried up, leading to more financial worries. National Express were content at taking the risk of the Intercity East Coast franchise, due to the fact that they had recently lost several franchises and wanted to remain in the rail industry, thus took the huge gamble on the East Coast franchise. The gamble had clearly not worked, as by mid-2009, National Express reportedly offered to pay the Department for Transport £100 million to be released from its commitment to operate the franchise, with this being rejected by the Transport Secretary. National Express, then again, pleaded to the Department for Transport to renegotiate the contract, but the Transport Secretary once again rejected this, suggesting that the government did not want to renegotiate due to the poor management of the companies, with burdens on the taxpayer likely. Regardless, in June 2009, the Department for Transport confirmed that National Express East Coast would default on the franchise, and the Department for Transport would step in by the end of 2009, or when National Express East Coast ran out of money, whichever came first, with the Department for Transport running the franchise as a nationalised one from then on. National Express themselves suggested that they were not going to inject cash into the East Coast company, letting it run solvent, and handed it to the government. National Express, in defaulting the franchise, only lost £72 million of potential royalties, so did not take the burden of not being able to run the franchise, although they have not been able to run a rail company since. Thus, many called for the renationalisation of the rail franchising system, especially left-wing Labour backbenchers. But the 2008 National Audit Report, which found rail franchising did deliver good value for money and good services, was the main argument posed by the government to counter the views against privatisation. Regardless, National Express East Coast, by the 14th of November 2009, was no more, and was replaced by the much more popular East Coast Company. Lasting just under 2 years, National Express East Coast did not do much as an operator. They didn't change much, they didn't even have time to put their branding on their trains, and they certainly didn't change travel on the East Coast for good, such as GNER, with the strict financial regulations not allowing National Express to bring forward the vision that they put out. National Express were just too greedy and were too desperate to keep themselves in the rail industry, and gambled on income streams that weren't steady nor reliable. But who is really at fault, National Express or the government? And is it a failed franchise? Realistically, both National Express and the Department for Transport are to blame. National Express made the overall service much poorer than what it was under GNER, especially catering and general service levels. They also increased fares and put forward unnecessary booking fees to try and recoup money lost in the unfortunately timed financial crisis. However, we must also blame the Department for Transport. They should have stepped in and renegotiated the contract, or accepted the £100 million that National Express were offering the government, which could have been used to improve the service. Well then, we should conclude. Are National Express East Coast truly a failed franchise? Yes, 100% in my opinion. Not only was their service poor, not focusing on the customer, but they took too many risks and became the laughingstock of Britain's rail network, not even lasting 2 years. However, the Department for Transport should, as aforementioned, take some blame. They once again asked an operator to pay a huge sum of money, which wasn't really feasible due to the financial crash. But, all in all, National Express East Coast are definitely a failed franchise in my opinion. 10 years into the East Coast Mainline being privatised, and there had already been 2 operators start and end. Could the next one be more successful? Find out in the next episode of my East Coast Mainline Failed Franchises mini-series, and make sure you catch up on the rest of my Failed Franchises videos. So then, what do you think overall? Am I being too lenient on National Express East Coast, or did they deserve their contract to be stripped from them? Well, let me know in the comments below. Do consider liking, subscribing and joining the channel. Special thanks to my first class member Callum Martyn Bell, and my business zone members Andrew Bowen, Anthony Harris, Craig Mitchell 43 and Smudgy Cat. Also thanks to Dara Rooney for his donations and membership. Apologies for the much shorter video today, but there's not much you can really write on a company that only lasted 2 years, so the fact that I've made it as long as it is at the moment is quite a success, to be fair. Thanks so much for watching regardless. Make sure you check out my other videos, subscribe and put the notification bell on so you don't miss any future videos, which I promise will be much longer than this one. Make sure you also check out my socials such as my Twitter, Discord and Instagram in the links below. And I'll see you soon. Goodbye.